And council members, ensure your microphones are turned on.
Who's in the house today?
Everybody. Well, not everybody, but
Is that Tia Ducky back there?
huh?
I think Tia Ducky here is here.
Yeah, he's back here.
Who's that man in the front row, Don Patterson? What? Who's the man in the front row? Is he on here?
All right, good evening. Today is January 8th, 2024. Today is a regular legislative meeting for Barberton City Council. Before we begin the regular legislative meeting for this evening, we will jump into some individual committee meetings. And we will start with City Properties, Parks and Recreation with Mr. Cheatham.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to call this meeting to order today, January 8th, 2024, at 6:08 p.m. All members of my committee are present. Tonight we have no new requests for legislation, and we have one pending legislation that we will be voting on tonight. It's a title commendation for Donna Kayam, a resolution for the city of Barberton to honor and give public recognition to Donna Kayam for her continued dedication to the city of Barberton. A motion was made to accept the request, and it was voted on and approved. With that, I pass.
You'll need a miscellaneous and a motion
Okay.
to,
Are there any miscellaneous? No. Or do I ask them if they? Yeah, okay. Any comments, miscellaneous?
Motion to adjourn.
Any comments from the gallery?
Just on behalf of Donna, she served on the Parks Commission for 33 years. I think it's very appropriate to give her recognition for that.
Thank you, sir. With that, motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
I'll second.
Thank you, Rebecca.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Okay, we are adjourned at 6:08 a.m. p.m. I'm sorry.
that's how I feel.
I feel
Thank you,
like
Mr. Cheatham.
last week with the 23.
All right, next up is Public Welfare and Safety with Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. President. This time I'll call the Public Welfare and Safety Committee to order. It's January 8th, 2024. The time is now 6:08 p.m. We're here in council chambers. All members of my committee are present, including myself as chair, Mr. Cheatham, Ms. Gerhart, and Mr. Greer. All the council members are present, and guests are noted on my sheet. We have one request for legislation. It's from Chief Morber from the Police Department, requesting legislation of a resolution to honor Officer Shannon Davis on her retirement after 26 years of service as a Barberton police officer. That is the only request that we have. Do I have a motion to call for it?
Motion.
I'll second that.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Any nays? Okay, motion passed. Then I have a pending legislation for the accommodation of Captain Fire Marshal Richard Hargrove. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton to honor and give public recognition to Richard W. Hargrove for his 32 years of dedicated service to the City of Barberton Fire Department and to our community. There was a motion, it passed, and go from there. Any miscellaneous discussion? Mr. Cheatham?
Is it pertaining to Shannon or the other person?
Any miscellaneous, you can
Okay.
talk about Shannon.
No, I just agree with the accommodation for Shannon Davis. Worked with her for years, and she's an outstanding person and officer. So,
Totally agree. Have a motion to adjourn? Oh, wait. Any comments from the gallery? Motion to adjourn?
motion.
Motion by Kenny.
I'll second that motion.
We are adjourned at 6:10 PM.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Next up is Rules, Marketing, and Development with Ms. Gerhart.
Thank you, Mr. President. At this time, I'd like to call the Rules, Marketing, and Development Committee to order. It is Monday, January 8th, 2024, and the time is 6:11 PM. We are in council chambers. All members of my committee are present, including myself as chair, Mrs. Beck, Mr. Heidig, and President Greer. All other council members and others as noted on my sheet. And we have no new requests for legislation at this time. Is there any miscellaneous discussion? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to remind everybody to review the rules when you get a chance and offer up any suggestions if you have any. It's not a requirement, just if you see anything. We do have one suggestion made by Mr. Heidick, which I'll make sure that everybody gets sent over to the Rules Committee. And we'll just continue to be on the lookout. Maybe in the next month or so, start having a discussion about some of the rules.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else? Anybody? Okay. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I will make that motion.
Thank you.
I will second that.
Thank you. And we are adjourned at 6:12 PM.
Thank you, Ms. Gerhart.
You're welcome.
Next up is City Utilities with Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to call this meeting to order today, January 8th. We are in council chambers. All members of my committee are present tonight. We have no new requests for legislation. We also have pending legislation that we'll be voting on tonight, titled ordinance number 7-2024. Bids and contract years requirements for materials and services, an ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Service to advertise for bids and enter into contract in 2024, covering the year's requirements for materials and services used in the ordinary and daily operation of the municipal department in the city of Barberton and declaring it emergency. Do I have any miscellaneous discussion on this? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I will second that.
Thank you, Mrs. Beck. We are adjourned at 6:14. With that, I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Last but not least, Finance and Personnel with Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to bring the Finance and Personnel Committee to order. It is Monday, January 8th, 2024, 6:14 PM here in council chambers. All members of the committee are present, which includes myself as chair, Mr. Heidick, Mr. Griffin, and President Greer. All other council members are present as well as guests as noted on my agenda sheet. We requested legislation for Committee of the Whole nights. So next up, we have the finance report for the month of December 2023.
Our revenues were just over 413,000, expenditures just under 377,000. Gives us a unexpended fund balance of a little over 1.8 million. From the start of the year to the end of the year, the fund balance increased by about 67,000 for the year. Moving on to the income tax fund for December, you'll notice the actual did not hit our estimate. It actually fell short by about almost $400,000. The reason for that is we had a company make estimated net profit tax payments like they needed to. However, when they filed it with the wrong city. It belonged to another RETA entity. So they had to take that money away from us to give to the other city where it belonged. So it cut into December. That's why we came up short by about 400,000. It's about 400,000 that had to go to the other cities. So no fault of RETA, no fault of the business. The business thought they were doing what was correct. They just filled out the paperwork incorrectly. So it's what it is, but good news is we still were over our estimate for the year. You'll notice we were over our estimate by about a little over 2.5 million, which if you compare the actuals from this year, or for 2023 to 2022, you'll notice our income tax fund, or what we collected was about $900,000 more from 22 to 23, so that's good. Moving on to the statement of cash positions. Two funds are in the negative. It's the usual two. First is the FEMA fund, so the flood mitigation grants that we have for 15, 14, those two streets, and also the grant for the dam. Those are all flowing through the FEMA fund. Once we pay out the money, we get reimbursed the money. So those will be reimbursed for. The other one is the CDBG fund. Well, that flows through HUD, so Department of Urban Development, through the federal government. So that one, once again, once we pay out the money, we can be reimbursed. Other than that, no other funds are in the negative. Moving on to the last 3 months, you'll notice the general fund went down from October, November, and December. It has decreased. A lot of that has to do with transfers. We haven't made really any transfers into the general fund since we maxed out our transfer back in October. So November and December, we operated with no transfers. Another thing in December that we had was a 3-pay month. So anytime we have a 3-pay month, those funds that are used to pay wages are also going to have more expenditures for the month. So that's basically why it trended downwards towards the end of the year. Hopefully with us being able to transfer from income tax to general fund again, and everything, that general fund balance will start to balance out, if not maybe rise a little bit. Special revenue funds, you'll notice that decreased by quite a bit. The unencumbered cash balance decreased by about 5.7 million. That's because 2 big projects kicked off. Well, 2 large POs got opened up because of 2 large projects. The first was this South Barberton project. We took out the POs for those. So that is coming from ARPA funds, which is part of the special revenue funds. So you have that large encumbrance, and then you also got the large encumbrance for the Worcester Road West project. We had to get the PO open towards the end of last year, and the legislation is in front of you to finalize that contract with ODOT, but we needed to get that purchase order entered at the end of last year. So those 2 large encumbrances is what's drawing down that. Enterprise funds, you'll notice decreased slightly. Once again, like I said, 3-pay month, quite a bit of payroll comes out of utilities just because of how large the utilities garage is. Administration, that has their wages split. And then all other funds is up by about 500,000. Comparing December of 22 to December of 23, you'll notice the general fund is down by about 4.7 million. A lot of that just has to deal with the us using the lost revenue funds that we sent over to the general fund from our funds, using those for those various projects. revenue funds is down by about 4 million. Once again, have to deal with those encumbrances for those two big projects. Enterprise funds is down by about $1 million. All other funds is up by about 127,000. And then you'll notice the unencumbered cash balance from last year to this year is down by almost 10 million. But 4 million of that, a lot of that is just due to those two big projects right there. So that's all I have. Any questions?
Go ahead, Mr. Heide.
By all means.
My question was, the special revenue fund, could you just for clarification, what are those two big projects again? The dam?
South Van Buren project, which is coming from the ARPA funds.
Okay.
And then the other one is the Worcester Road West project. So the reconstruction of Worcester Road West from 2nd Street all the way down to Hudson Run.
And to clarify even further, the ARPA was general fund.
ARPA,
Is that,
no, that's part of special revenues. So-
okay, that's
So
where I
we
was
had-
wondering.
The ARPA funds kind of got split. We sent some and made them committed funds in the general fund. That was the lost revenue portion. And that's where, like, we paid for the acquisition of the First Marathon over there. We used those funds. Now you have the ARPA funds, which is restricted by ARPA guidelines, which is being used for the South Van Buren project, for that whole reconstruction of that corridor.
Awesome. Thank you, Director.
Yes.
With new counselors here, would you be able to provide this week a spreadsheet of the ARPA funds, what's been used, what's left, and just the whole snapshot?
Yeah, I gotta get that reporting done for the federal government, so once I get that all taken care of for the federal government, I'll get it sent out to council.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Can I have a motion to accept the finance report for December 2023?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Heide. And a second? Those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. For pending legislation, we have, with streets, a contract to enter into contract with the Streets Department for Breezy Trucking and Paving Company Incorporated, amending ordinance number 102-2023, an ordinance amending ordinance 102-2023, the 2023 concrete and sidewalk replacement program to reflect an increase in the bid not to exceed $5,497.95 for a total contract amount of $702,627.75 due to replacing sidewalk in poor condition bounded by and along 1st and 2nd Street, including several ADA ramps, and declaring an emergency. Mr. Shreve, can you tell us exactly where this is at as far as 1st and 2nd Street goes?
I believe this is part of the sidewalk program that Mike actually helped put together, so I'm going to let him
Perfect.
explain, yes.
Thank you.
So at the end of the project, there was a little bit of extra concrete to make final connections, replace some gaps, some additional wheelchair ramps. It was a very small little bit of extra work that needed to be done that went over the original contract amount. The contractor was in the area. We got a good bid pricing. It made sense to do the work, and when the math came out at the end of the over/under on every quantity, we were 5,000 and change short on a $700,000 contract. So this just pays that extra $5,000 above what the original contract work was for.
Okay. Thank you. And this is northwest, 1st and 2nd Street.
Just north of Robinson, at 1st and 2nd Street.
Northeast?
Northeast, I believe.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have. Are there any other questions or comments regarding that? Okay. All right. We also have a request for an appointment from the Barberton Community Foundation for Mr. Michael Andrick for a 3-year term, beginning 1/18/2024 through 12/31/2026. Are there any questions, comments regarding that? Okay, I will open this up for miscellaneous. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Harden.
I signed in to speak, but it might be appropriate to speak now.
Sure.
Tom Harmon, 94 Metalwood.
Sorry, Mr. Harden, can you step up to the microphone so? Just-
Tom Harmon, 904 Metalwood, Barberton. As some of you know, I'm on the school board. Mike is an administrator there. He's in charge of the Business Advisory Council. And Barberton's done it right. We've got about 60 companies in the council, and Mike is in charge of this. As one of the areas of concentration of the foundation is economic development. So I personally think that Mike, as being the person in charge of the Business Advisory Council, would be a valuable addition to the foundation, especially in economic development. And I know there may be some questions about that, but I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. In my previous life, I was also on the foundation board, and I was also the executive director. So if there's any questions about that, between myself and Mrs. Peters, we're more than happy to answer.
Are there any, Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Chair. If I may address Mr. Harnden there?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Mr. Harnden, the Business Advisory Council, you said this person is the head of it, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Being it a council, what is the membership comprised of, and how does one become a member of the Business Advisory Council?
They're basically businesses in Barberton, Ohio. They've been approached by the superintendent and by Mr. Andrew to join. It's a requirement by the state of Ohio that we have a Business Advisory Council. Barberton has done it correctly. Instead of just identifying one business and going out to them, we actually invite the businesses into the high school on a recurring basis, on a quarterly basis, meet with them, listen to any concerns they have, and hopefully be able to integrate their concerns into the curriculum at the high school. So, as an example, we put in place a Six Sigma program at the high school, where now our high school students, if they go through the program, can graduate with a yellow belt. I guess you go all the way up to black belts. I'm not really familiar with all this, but it makes them more employable. So it's turned out to be very valuable. The city of Barberton's one of the companies, one of the organizations that are actually part of the Business Advisory Council, and we've instituted a program with the city where some of our students are able to do some internships with the city, and we've been able to do that with some other companies also. Actually, we're doing it with the high school. Some of the kids are involved with the maintenance program at the high school. So it's been a very valuable program, and Mike is in charge of it.
Mr. Heidick?
So, to become a member on this council,
Anybody can be-
who is the appointing authority?
There's not an appointing, you don't get appointed. If you'd like to join as a business, come on down. We've had some new businesses come into town. I know Topcraft was recently purchased by a company out of Canton, and when they requested some tax abatement, one of the deals we cut with them is join the Business Advisory Council, which they've done. They've been attending our meetings. Did the same thing with Eberhard Landscaping and any other business. There's no restrictions. More the merrier. We want our kids to get exposed to these businesses. There are opportunities for our kids to get jobs after graduation.
Does that answer your question?
So I have Green Diamond, what's the point? Come on down.
Now, I may have read the articles of incorporation of it wrong, but does the school board appoint the members of the council to a one-year term, or was I
No.
reading the wrong thing?
No. School board has nothing to do with it, other than approving the program. But no, anybody can, any business in Barberton, if they want to join, if they can join, we approach businesses and ask them to join. We're being aggressive in that regard. But no, if you know of a business that would be beneficial to join the Business Advisory Council, talk to Mike and we'll get them invited.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes?
One quick question. Do we have any numbers on how many students
from like the Four City Compact from Barberton have gone on to actually get jobs in the field that they went through from the Four City Compact?
I don't have that. I don't know if we'd have that. From the Four City Compact, I would probably have to talk to the administrator of that, but I'm sure somebody's tracking that. If they're not, they should be. But I don't have the information. Sorry.
Because I know it's
Oh, yeah.
a great program. My
Oh,
son
it's
went to
outstanding.
Machine Tech there.
Yeah, no, it's an outstanding program.
Yeah.
But I don't know if there's any questions about how many people are allowed to be on the board or all that kind of stuff or not. I know at one point, I worked for the school district as the owner's representative during our school construction. At the same time, I was on the foundation board as a board member. So there was no conflict. I just had to recuse myself from voting on anything school-related. And in the case of Mike, if he's appointed by the city council, he will be a city representative. And in my opinion, he would have to recuse himself from voting on anything school-related because he's representing the city, not the schools. And I know that's occurred in the past. I know in the past we've had city representatives that were not appointed by the city, like Mike Vinay when he was a service director, Leon Rex when he was the safety director, Dan Knorr when he's a city employee and supervisor in the parks. So it's not, there's precedent for having employees of both the city and the schools be on the board that are not at the same time. Mr. Cheatham.
Yes, on this business advisory council.
Yeah.
You talked about some pros. Has there been any cons?
No.
No?
No, we're getting input from the businesses, and to the extent that we can integrate it into the curriculum, we're doing it.
Great. Thank you.
How often does the council meet?
Quarterly.
Quarterly?
In fact, we have a meeting coming Thursday morning.
Thursday morning?
They meet at the high school, they're all invited. Give them some coffee and croissants and make them happy.
Food's always good.
Thank you.
Is there anything else? Miscellaneous for finance? Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mayor, do you have a timeline for the budget for presentations?
No. Had a couple meetings so far with department heads, lining the rest of them up. Just got the budget last week, so I've been working on it all weekend. So I don't have time frame yet. Hopefully by the end of the month.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. With nothing else, can I have a motion to adjourn, please?
I will second that.
All right, we are adjourned at 6:33.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. That concludes our individual committee meetings for this evening. We're going to take a short 5-10 minute break, get things in order, and we'll begin the regular legislative meeting.
Night.
All right, we're going to begin here in a couple seconds. Please ensure your cell phones are off or on silent. Council members, ensure your microphones are turned on.
I need to stop like rubbing my fingers against it. I did that last time.
We're talking about air movement. It's not you.
Oh, okay.
It is freezing.
I even turned it up. Just saying.
I feel great.
It's not this
I feel good now.
It's not as chilly now.
Okay.
You want me to open the window?
All right, today's Monday, January 8th, 2024. This is a regular legislative meeting of Barberton City Council. I call this meeting to order at 6:51 p.m. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by invocation by myself. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Heavenly Father, watch over us as we enter the new year, the new council members. Give them the courage, the strength to stand up when things, stand up for their morals. Be kind and considerate and listen. Please watch over our first responders. Please watch over our safety forces, military. And always remember the 22. Amen. Clerk, please call the roll.
President Greer.
Present.
Mr. Hyden.
Here.
Mrs. Thompson.
Here.
Mrs. Hager.
Here.
Mr. Cheatham.
Here.
Mr. Griffin.
Here.
Mrs. Beck.
Here.
Ms. Gerhart.
Here.
Mr. Harris.
Here.
Approval of the minutes. Approval of the minutes of the sign die meeting held on Tuesday, January 2nd, 2024. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the approval of the minutes of the sign die meeting from Tuesday, January 2nd, 2024.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's to approve the minutes from the sign die meeting held on Tuesday, January 2nd, 2024.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the sign die meeting held on Tuesday, January 2nd, 2024 as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right, minutes are adopted. Approval of the minutes of the approval of the minutes of the organizational meeting held on Tuesday, January 2nd, 2024. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the approval of the minutes of the organizational meeting held on Tuesday, January 2nd, 2024.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to approve the minutes of the organizational meeting held on Tuesday, January 2nd, 2024.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the organizational meeting held on Tuesday, January 2nd, 2024 as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Minutes are adopted. Finance report, there is none. Petitions and claims?
We have none.
Thank you. Matters requested?
They have all been.
Thank you. Citizens addressing council. Mr. Hardin was on there. I've asked him to be removed from the list. Is there, I didn't see any. Okay. There are no citizens addressing council. We'll move into first reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Resolution number 1-2024, presented by Mr. Cheatham. Title, Commendation, Donna Kine. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton to honor and give public recognition to Donna Kine for her continuous dedication to the City of Barberton.
Thank you. Motion to suspend. Mr. Cheatham.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Ms. Gerhart.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mr. Cheatham's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Cheatham and seconded by Ms. Gerhart to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Cheatham.
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Cheatham.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the adoption of resolution number 1-204.
2023
2024.
or 24.
Yes, 2024.
Thank you. And Ms. Gerhart?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mr. Cheatham's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Cheatham and seconded by Ms. Gerhart to adopt resolution number 1-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 2-2024, presented by Mrs. Beck and Mrs. Thompson. Title, enter into contract Streets Department for Breezy Trucking and Paving Company Incorporated, amending ordinance number 102-2023. An ordinance amending ordinance number 102-2023, enter into contract 2023 concrete sidewalk replacement program to reflect an increase in the bid amount not to exceed $5,497.95 for a total contract amount of $702,627.75 due to replacing sidewalk in poor condition bounded by and along First Street and Second Street, including several ADA ramps, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Beck's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Beck and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for adoption of ordinance number 2-2024.
Thank you. And Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Beck's motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Beck and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to adopt ordinance number 2-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Ms. Hager?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 3-2024, presented by Mr. Harris. Title, Commendation, Captain Fire Marshal Richard W. Hargrove. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton to honor and give public recognition to Richard W. Hargrove for his 32 years of dedicated service to the City of Barberton's Fire Department and to this community.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mr. Cheatham?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mr. Harris's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Harris and seconded by Mr. Cheatham to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of resolution number 3-2024.
Thank you. And Mr. Cheatham?
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mr. Harris's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Harris and seconded by Mr. Cheatham to adopt resolution number 3-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham.
Yes.
Mrs. Hager.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart.
Yes.
Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mrs. Beck.
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 4-2024, presented by Mrs. Beck. Title, enter into contract, ODOT final resolution. A final resolution authorizing the mayor to enter into contract with the Ohio Department of Transportation, ODOT, for the improvement of Worcester Road West from 31st Street Northwest to 4th Street Northwest with sidewalk upgrades on bridge SUM-10-0361 over Wolf Creek and bridge number SUM-11-0270 over Hudson Run, including pavement, planning, resurfacing, concrete pavement, and drainage, along with curb sidewalk, curb ramp, traffic signal, and sewer and water upgrades lying within the city of Barberton and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend. Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mr. Harris?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Beck's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Beck and seconded by Mr. Harris to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Mrs. Hager.
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mrs. Beck.
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of Resolution Number 4.2024.
Thank you. Mr. Harris?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Beck's motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Beck and seconded by Mr. Harris to adopt resolution number 4-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Beck.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart.
Yes.
Mrs. Hager.
Yes.
Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Motion for adoption passes.
Ordinance number 5-2024, presented by Mrs. Beck. Title, 2024 Street Road Salt Program. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into contract with Cargill Incorporated for the 2024 Street Road Salt Program through Community University Education Regional Purchasing Council of Governments, CUE-COG, and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Harris?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Beck's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Beck and seconded by Mr. Harris to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mrs. Hager.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Beck.
Yes.
Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham.
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 5.2003.
Should be 4.
5-2024.
Oh, it's a typo. Sorry, excuse me.
Just go ahead and say it one more time.
2024.
The whole thing, please.
Whole thing? Okay.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 5-2024.
Thank you. And Mr. Harris?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Beck's motion for adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Beck and seconded by Mr. Harris to adopt ordinance number 5-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Cheatham.
Yes.
Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Mrs. Beck.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Hyden?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 6-2024, presented by Mrs. Beck, title, Enter into Contract GPD Group Incorporated. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into contract with GDP Group Incorporated, GPD, for general professional engineering services, including but not limited to permissive and residential street resurfacing programs, infrastructure improvement, design, management, street crack sealing, street stripping, and miscellaneous engineering management services, and declaring an emergency.
Can you say that again? No, I'm just playing. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mr. Harris?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Beck's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Beck and seconded by Mr. Harris to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Hyden?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 6-2024.
Thank you. And Mr. Harris?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Beck's motion for adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Beck and seconded by Mr. Harris to adopt ordinance number 6-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Hyden?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 7-2024, presented by Mr. Griffin and Mrs. Beck. Title, 2024 Bids and Contracts, Years Requirements for Materials and Services. An ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Service to advertise for bids and/or enter into contracts in 2024 covering the year's requirements for materials and services used in the ordinary and daily operation of the municipal departments in the city of Barberton and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Beck?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mr. Griffin's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Griffin and seconded by Mrs. Beck to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mrs. Hager?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Hyden?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 7-2024.
Thank you. And Mrs. Beck?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mr. Griffin's motion to adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Griffin and seconded by Mrs. Beck to adopt ordinance number 7-2024. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Hyden?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Ms. Gerhart?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Ms. Hager?
Yes.
Mrs. Beck?
Yes.
Mr. Cheatham?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
This ends the first reading.
Second reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
Third reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
Appointments.
To the Barberton Community Foundation, Mr. Michael Andrick for a 3-year term to begin January 18th, 2024 through December 31st, 2026.
Thank you. Do I have a motion to appoint Mr. Andricks? Ms. Thompson?
I'll be abstaining this evening due to my employment with Barberton City Schools.
Thank you. Next in line is Mr. Heidick. No motion. Next in line, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to make a motion to appoint Mr. Andrew.
Thank you. Given that there's not enough motions, Rule 404, motions, puts, and voted on Barberton City Council rules state that motions and puts are made by the committee that call the appointment, legislation, and resolution out of committee, being that 2 of the 4, 1 abstain, 1 no, 1 vote, which makes me a tiebreaker, and I de facto go to the position that we are currently in without change, which there would be no motion from me. No other motion can be made by a council member to move forward on the appointment, and the motion would fail for the appointment of Mr. Andricks. Miscellaneous and unfinished business. Just a reminder that next week is a committee of the whole meeting. However, we do not have a meeting on the 15th. That's Martin Luther King Day. The city will be closed that day too as well. We'll shift over to Tuesday the 16th. Give me 1 sec. Is this for me or for them?
I won't even be able to see the text if I get
Okay, you're going to make me try to read this. Okay. This is just a reminder that the council clerk will be out of the office on Wednesday, will not be in the office on Wednesday, and we'll be back in 12 p.m. to 4:30 on Thursday and 8 a.m. noon on Friday this week. You're very welcome. You're more than welcome to say that, but is there anything from council members? Anything from department heads? And communication from the mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to thank you for the accommodation for Donna Kine. She spent a lot of time on the Parks Board and volunteering throughout the city for various events like the Bump Festival. She's really been a staple here in the city as part of the parks, and I appreciate her years of service. I don't think a lot of people realize that events like the Bump Festival would not happen if it wasn't for volunteers. And these aren't volunteers that come down. I mean, it includes volunteers that come down for a couple hours, but there's people like Donna and others who spend days at the Bump Festival. I remember when I was on council, there were times when we would sign up for 4 hours at a time throughout the night, keep an eye on things, tents and vendors, products and things like that. And so council members and volunteers were the ones that donated their time and were up on the golf cart all night long, making sure that everything was taken care of. And Donna was one of those for many, many, many years. I want to thank the Parks Department, the members of the Active Adult Center, as well as my staff. We hosted and served lunch to the Active Adult Center for their members for their New Year's Eve party. We do this every year. They have live entertainment, great food, great people. So thank you for allowing us to do that. Change for Change is January 26th at M&M Tap House, benefiting Main Street. We're still collecting non-perishables, benefiting Backham and Salvation Army. Actually dropped off 2 loads of non-perishables today, one at Backham and one at Salvation Army. So thank you to everyone who donated for those. As mentioned earlier, working on the 2024 budget, having budget meetings with department heads. So during the budget meetings or hearings that we have here, I'll have each department head get up and explain, kind of present their budget and answer any questions. I've done that in the past, but typically, we'll have the department head in the audience here because they know their budget and their department better than anyone else. So we'll all be here to answer questions. And I'll repeat myself when I say this. If someone presents on day 1 and you don't have any questions, you go home, you're looking through it, you're looking through your notes, you have questions the next week, not a problem. You can always ask questions, even if it's the night of the vote and we've had X number of meetings, you can still ask questions, even if something was presented on day 1, right? So it's not normal to understand municipal finance, so I expect a lot of questions. You should have a lot of questions. And if you want to stop in beforehand or anytime during the week and ask any questions, please contact my office and let's get that scheduled. Met last week with the business in town looking to expand to a much larger building, so we're looking to try to help them. We've been working with them for a number of years. It was, they needed a new building, and now things have moved a little faster. They need a building. So that's all good stuff. Want to make sure we keep them in town. Want to make sure we have the inventory of types of buildings and size of buildings that they need. So we're going through that exercise now. With the drastic changes in weather, whether that's the cold weather, the rain, snow, freezing temperatures, the high wind, and anything else that Mother Nature throws at us, just be mindful of those that may be walking to and from school or to work. It's still dark out early in the evening and late in the morning. And also make sure you check on your neighbors who may not have the resources. If you find a neighbor who doesn't have heat or food or something like that, there's a lot of resources out there, and if we can't help them directly, we can point them in the right direction, so please contact us. With this, we've been keeping on top of the changes in the weather. We heard from First Energy earlier, late afternoon, early evening, on their preparedness for the weather conditions. And if you've been watching the Weather Channel, it's coming up from the south, and some cold air is coming from Canada, so it's kind of all mixing together. But as we know, this is Northeast Ohio, we can totally bypass this. So, but wanted to send out, customers can receive emails and text messages from First Energy with updates. You have to log on to firstenergycorp.com/connect, and then you can input your information and they will send you updates via email or text. So a lot of good information there. So that's all I have for this evening. Are there any questions? Yes.
Thank you, Mayor. Could you repeat that domain name again one more time for that?
All one word, firstenergycorp, corp.com/connect.
Thank you.
I would have sent that out with the council updates last week, but that just came across my desk. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you, Mayor. With Congress starting to try to grind out things, has there been any status update on the grant requests for Lake Anna, and I believe there was another one?
No, one was in Congress for Lake Anna, the other one was in the Senate for sidewalks. So no updates yet.
And if they do go through, do we already have the plans for Lake Anna, or I know we had the public meetings and whatnot, but are those aren't the finalized one, I assume?
No. I mean, we've got a lot of due diligence done. We've done a lot of public outreach. So we have a lot of ideas and information. It's getting down to the quotes of the specifics. So, the time frame would be, once it passes, it's anticipated to take a month, maybe a month and a half for the president to sign it into law, and then probably 6 to 10 months, give or take 6 or 10 months, up to money actually coming here. So we're trying to stay on top of that as much as possible. There hasn't been any updates.
Are those, the plans that you said you're looking for quotes and all that, are those available to the council?
No, we don't have any. I'll check with Mike and see what we have on paper right now. I know there's been a lot of things kind of tossed around, and I know I've been working with some property owners in town on putting a kind of deal together to update Lake Anna in a historic fashion. There's nothing on paper with that. Let me get with everyone on my side.
Thank you.
Yep. Anything else? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. With nothing else, do I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to adjourn.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson that we adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Didn't think so. This meeting is adjourned at 7:19 p.m.